I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast. On this week's episode, Times book critic Dwight Garner joins me to talk about the oral history, that cacophonous format in which quotes from tens, dozens, hundreds of people are chopped up and edited together to present a fragmented, very often entertaining version of events. The reason for this specific conversation? A new book called The Freaks Came Out to Write, The Definitive History of the Village Voice, the radical paper that changed American culture, by Tricia Romano, which Dwight recently wrote about for the book review. Dwight, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, Gilbert. It's great to be here.
So there's so many ways in which we could start this conversation, but let's just, I grew up in New York. I've read The Village Voice I read The Village Voice for so much of my life. I like to assume that everyone knows what The Village Voice was. Maybe that's small-minded of me in my own way. Tell us, what was The Village Voice?
Well, there was once upon a time, every major American city had an alternative weekly. It was a weekly newspaper, kind of a little bit lefty, a lot of arts culture, a lot of arts coverage in it, good listings, good classified ads. It's where you went to read movie reviews to find out where your favorite band was playing and that kind of thing. And very few of them exist now in any kind of real state in America. There's a good one still in Burlington, Vermont, but it's rare. The Voice was the sort of original. I mean, it was founded by a group of writers and editors in 1955 that included Norman Mailer. And the paper was meant to be a downtown New York paper. Downtown, for people not in New York, sort of means below 14th Street, or it used to mean that. And the paper sort of grew, and by the 1960s, it had really hit its stride as an alternative voice, especially alternative to this newspaper. Its favorite enemy was the New York Times, which it saw as the man, and very straight-laced indeed. And one of the things in this book, whenever some major victory happens, one of the characters will say, one of the writers will say, well, you wouldn't read about that in the New York Times. But The Voice covered in a way that no one else did. They discovered really off-Broadway plays. They started the Obie Awards. They had Jules Feiffer's really literate cartoons, which won a Pulitzer Prize. They had great news coverage, amazing early rock and hip-hop coverage of dance, coverage of movies. And they discovered they sort of discovered alternative culture in America. And they were really a major voice, too, in terms of feminism, in terms of gay life in the city, civil rights, just a really busy, loud, voice-driven. Village Voice is a great name for it because all the voices were in the first person, or many did, and it made the place feel really lively. Anyway, that's part of what the Village Voice was. It still exists in a minor form online, but it really doesn't exist anymore.
And we can talk a little bit later, perhaps, about the unfortunate fate that many alt weeklies have suffered as a result of the internet. But let's start sort of in the early years of The Voice. As you say, it was co-founded in part by Norman Mailer. And downtown, as you rightly point out, in New York is considered to be below 14th Street. But downtown is also a state of mind, essentially, that The Voice really tried to capture through its coverage of, you know, not only alternative culture, but just culture in general. As you point out in your review, and anyone who's read The Voice or any alternative weeklies sort of can recall, you had the front of the book, the first half of the book, which was the part that maybe did local investigations. We should talk a little bit about Wayne Barrett and his early writing about Donald Trump. But then the back of the book had all that amazing arts criticism. You care about it. I care about it. Hopefully some of our readers sort of read this stuff when they were growing up. But it was really it was an amazing, by the time I was reading it, free newspaper that you used to be able to pick up in movie theater lobbies, on street corners. I can still remember the plastic red newspaper containers on street corners. And it was a way to find out before the internet, in particular, everything that was happening in New York City. Or if you lived in D.C. and read the city paper, anything that was happening in D.C., who was playing at the 930 Club, you know, what movies were playing at this local movie theater. It's a shame that these places don't exist anymore. But the wonderful thing about The Freaks Came Out to Write, this oral history, is that it is this very fat account of everything that the Village Voice did and all the crazy writers that ran through this newsroom. It was a place that really encouraged almost fights amongst its writers. People were very comfortable arguing amongst themselves in the newsroom, in the letter section, and I often felt like that energy was reflected in the newspaper itself.
Oh, absolutely. I remember I grew up in the suburbs and I went to college, and I remember finding the Village Voice for the first time when I was in college and just having my mind blown. I'd never seen anything like that. And I just felt like looking at this, I sort of found my people in a weird way, my sensibility reflected in terms of the kind of arts that this place was covering, just in terms of the kind of voices they had and how open they were about writing about culture. This was not like reading Time Magazine or Newsweek or the New York Times. As great as the Times is, it had its focus on sort of international news and serious news, and it wasn't covering the sort of grit of life the way the Village Voice covered it. And I remember subscribing to it, and it would arrive in the mail like 2 weeks late, being really beaten up by the post office, and because probably the post office guys didn't like it very much, because as someone says in this book, the typical cover looked like it was the New York Post on acid run by communists. So it was kind of the look that it went for. And the covers were really pushy and great. And they put Patti Smith on the cover in her early full glory, back when she was radical looking, back when she started out. And they covered CBGBs, all the sort of initial punk movement and the CBGBs movement, and all the downtown artists like Karen Finley, who became the artist who drew the ire of many Republican senators in terms of the public money she got for her art. And I remember also, this is just my own story, moving to New York City in 1993. This was before the internet. The Voice was where you went to get your apartment. They had great apartment listings, and people would line up on the night before publication to try to grab an early copy. And my wife and I did that, and that's how we found our first apartment in Brooklyn. So it just touched your life in a million different ways.
One quote in this book, which has tens of thousands of quotes possibly, is from someone who maybe worked on the advertising side, I'm not sure, who said on that point, "Nothing sold as much per line than a classified ad. We couldn't even handle the amount of classified advertising that came in. This is all apartment searching. People found their lives through the Village Voice, whether it was a partner or a job or an apartment." And for those who don't remember what the economics of alt weeklies or even newspapers in general were decades ago, classified advertising like this was the reliable backbone of that economy, where you knew that you could go to The Voice and look for an apartment. You knew that you could go to the New York Times, your local newspaper, and look for a job. There's a reason when you watch old movies, some guy's out of work, he picks up a newspaper, folds it in half, takes out his red pen, and is circling jobs. That was just the way you did things back then. And it's hard for a conversation about an institution that sort of no longer exists not to devolve into a nostalgia fest, but there is something very tactile about all the things that are described about The Voice in this oral history.
I totally agree. And one of the things I say in my review is, even though this book is warm and it's familial, there's not really a rosy glow of nostalgia that hangs over it. I mean, people are still kind of mad about some stuff, and they're still excited about what they did there. And it doesn't devolve into this kind of rolling of credits that you sometimes feel in this kind of thing, where everyone's talking about just their glory moment. There's no kumbaya vibe in this book. And yet, because of that, there is a kumbaya vibe. The anti-kumbaya makes the kumbaya. It just, the fact that they're still all talking over each other just reminds you of what The Voice was. And it's not just what they covered, it's how they covered it. I mean, they would send a poet like Amiri Baraka down to cover in New Orleans in a Muhammad Ali fight. They would assign someone in the middle of someone who worked for a feminist organization to write a great inside piece about that organization or about our own first-person experience in this organization. They wouldn't always go to experts. They would go to people in the movements themselves to write a lot of different first-person pieces from various angles. And it really worked for them. And they just, especially during the AIDS crisis, they just, to use a phrase that our former editor, Hal Raines, liked to use, now a discredited term, flood the zone. But they did flood the zone in terms of the AIDS crisis. And a lot of the pieces they ran, I still remember very well. And so it brings all this up. And the front of the book gets slighted a bit, but the news coverage was not just the Voice played rough. Jack Newfield, the famous muckraking reporter, was one of their guys, and he would do this annual feature called The 10 Worst Landlords in New York City. Another one called The 10 Worst Judges in New York City. Holy cow. I would love to read that today. I remember reading it then and going, holy cow, what a thing to do. And he reported the hell of it. It wasn't just a drive-by shooting of anyone. He really reported the stuff out.
The book is composed of just a ton of little chapters in which, this topic or that topic is dealt with. And there's a section during the years when Rupert Murdoch owned the Village Voice, because Rupert Murdoch at what point owned the Village Voice, where a bunch of the former employees are talking about their lawyer and how important the lawyer was because of the number of lawsuits that they were threatened with on a regular basis. Almost every week they were threatened with at least one lawsuit. And certainly when it came to recurring features like 10 Worst Landlords or 10 Worst Judges, that was really dicey territory for a newspaper that was still relatively new to go into. Can you imagine the legal pressure that a newspaper would be under if you decided just to name the 10 worst judges in New York.
Oh, man. And this book actually makes you respect Rupert Murdoch, as implausible as that might seem, a bit more than you might already coming into it. Because Rupert was smart enough mostly to leave the Voice alone. Even when they attacked him, which they would do fairly often, he knew, he was sort of told and he realized that if he tried to clamp down on these voices, they would just go across the street and start another paper. And he kind of knew that. He knew that the Voice's credibility was in its freedom, and he didn't really mess with them, even though he wanted to.
Talking about the, quote, front of the book, and again, these are terms that journalists use, listeners. Front of the book is all the news stuff, and back of the book is all the culture, lifestyle stuff. I mentioned the name Wayne Barrett briefly. He is someone who, from the early days on The Voice, really wrote about young Donald Trump and his father, Fred, and the real estate empire that they had in the outer boroughs. And he was definitely the first person to bring an investigative reporting mindset to the ways that the man who had become our now former president sort of spoke. And I believe a lot of the reporting that has been done since on Donald Trump, biographies of Donald Trump, reporting that our own reporters have done here at the New York Times, are really based on the foundation that someone like Wayne Barrett set at the Village Voice.
Yeah, you're right. It's a foundational document. And there's a lot of guys like Wayne Barrett at The Voice in those days. As a matter of fact, there's some criticism in this book of the fact that the news guys tended to be older white guys, kind of pugnacious guys, big beer drinkers, hanging out at the local literary bars. And the back of the book tended to be more multicultural, all kinds of voices back there. The news was pretty white. I mean, I can't make that a blanket statement, but that was sort of the dichotomy that some felt. But to give these guys credit, they were tough and they took no prisoners, and they were very good reporters, and their spawn is everywhere. Newfield and Barrett and others had a lot of interns during their time and worked with a lot of young reporters who have gone on to have great careers, many of them here at the Times. As a matter of fact, one of the editors, I'm going to get his name wrong, I'm not even going to say it, but who they brought in to run The Voice at one point was someone from the New York Times. And the staff rebelled originally because the New York Times, oh my God, we don't want their kind of journalism here. And yet it turned out that the place changed him more than he changed it. And he was now seen as a great leader of The Voice.
I think we both took great pleasure and amusement in how many times they took a crap on the New York Times in the pages of this book. But, listen, it's 2024. We're both wearing cardigans. Like, I don't know if we're stuffy in our own way, but I have to imagine that in the 1970s and 1980s, the New York Times was pretty uptight.
Yeah, I also remember when I first arrived at the Times in 1998, people still recalled, and there was still a sense that I was imparted to me that the Village Voice, you weren't really supposed to talk about it too much in the New York Times. Even in 1998, there was a sense that a previous editor, Max Frankel, I guess, really had a dislike for the Voice. I think they went after his New York Times a fair amount. And the Times, the other things we haven't talked about, the Voice did great press coverage. By press coverage, I mean sort of mean columns about the press. Press clips was one of the columns that one person wrote. Alexander Coburn had a press column, and these were kind of covering the media in a way that other people really hadn't covered the media. This was a new thing The Voice did as well. And it was very critical of the New York Times, but not just the New York Times, American media in general. And all these other things we're not talking about. I mean, The Voice had great photographers. This guy, Fred McDara, who, if you ever see Fred McDara's books about Manhattan in a bookstore, please look at them. He was there for the Beat movement. He was there at the Stonewall riots. This guy was everywhere that mattered. And he just sort of the right place at the right time and had a great eye. And he was one of the Voice's central photographers. Sylvia Plaikey, if I'm getting that name correctly, was another one. They would just have a picture in every issue, like Sylvia Plaikey's, had a name like Sylvia Plaikey's frame or her week, her one picture a week from Sylvia Plaikey. It didn't have to be anything particular. It was just a photograph, and it was beautiful. And they had not just Jules Feiffer as a cartoonist. They had Stan Mack, who did a thing called Real Life Funnies, in which he wandered the city and overheard dialogue and made cartoons out of it. And sometimes he would do this at a riot or a protest. Other times it would be just a conversation at a diner. They had Mark Allen Stamety, who used to have a column in the Book Review, actually, a cartoon column, who has this really dense style. He's written some great kids' books. One is about donuts you could look for if you're interested in that. But all these different pieces every week made it the thing that it was.
Did you ever work at an alt weekly?
Oh, I'm glad you brought this up. I wrote a lot for the Village Voice. I mean, when I say a lot, I mean probably 8 or 9 times. I was writing for them when I was still in college. I wrote book reviews it was called the Village Voice Literary Supplement, or the VLS. And I wrote for them a lot in the late 80s and early 90s. And then you sort of realize when you're a young kid like me, just starving. At the time, I was still in Vermont, and then I moved to Brooklyn. book reviews were a thing that I could learn to sell to alternative weeklies. So I became a contributing editor at the Boston Phoenix, was Boston's version of the Village Voice. I wrote a lot for the paper in Seattle.
The Stranger?
It wasn't The Stranger. There was another one then, and I'm blanking on it. But the San Francisco Bay Guardian I wrote for. And I even sold pieces twice sometimes, because back then no one could tell. The internet now, you can never sell a piece twice. I read a piece and sell it to two places. And that's how many alternative weeklies there were, that I sometimes got away with that. So anyway, I love that world. It's the world that I come out of. And matter of fact, probably one of my very best friends in the world is the person who runs the Alternative Weekly now in Burlington, Vermont. It's called 7 Days. And I was an arts editor in Burlington. My first job out of college really was as an arts editor for an alternative weekly called the Vanguard Press in Burlington, Vermont, which no longer exists, but one of my best friends runs the new one there. So it's very much of who I am and where I come from. And it was a joy for me to go revisit those times in this book.
The opening of your review for the book review reads as following: "The Freaks came out to write maybe the best history of a journalistic enterprise I've ever read, in that its garrulous tone so mirrors the institution's own." Later on, you say the tone of The Freaks came out to write is, and I love this, a symphonic kind of anarchy. Could you, for people who may be thinking about reading this book, sort of tease that out, that tone, a little bit more?
Well, you have to have good knife skills as an editor to make one of these books. And if you've ever tried to edit interviews, you know how hard it is. Even a simple interview that you've done with someone, to try to make it palatable in print is kind of a hard thing to do. And I was aware of the authors. Remind me of the author's name, Gilbert. Tricia Romano.
Tricia Romano.
Right. And frankly, I hadn't heard of her before this, even though she worked at The Voice for 8 years in its later stages. I hadn't heard of her before this book. But she clearly has great knife skills. She has a way of chopping up the comments so they really speak to each other and move along quickly. And I came to admire her. And the more you read of this book, the more you realize that even though her questions are not in it, you get a sense of how people are reacting, that she's asking good ones. Because someone will say something, someone will cross-cut and come in and sort of contradict that. And it's just well put together, I felt, the entire way through.
She wrote, for a time, the nightlife columns there, which maybe is why you're not familiar with her, because you don't strike me as a dancer.
Oh, well, it's not too late.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. I'm here with Dwight Garner, and we are discussing The Freaks Came Out to Write, the definitive history of the Village Voice, the radical paper that changed American culture, by Tricia Romano. We've just spoken a little bit about The Voice, about the book. Dwight, you just talked about the way in which someone that puts together an oral history has to sort of have a really sharp knife in order to have those what can often be amazing juxtapositions together in one of these books. And I'd love to take a step back and talk more generally about oral histories as a format. It is a reliable journalistic format, certainly. I used to work, you have big oral histories, and then I've worked in online media for quite a while, which loves to take oral histories and just slice them thinner and thinner. You're getting the really beautiful thin ham that you can pile on top of a cold cut sandwich. When I was at Vulture, which is New York Magazine's culture site, I was just looking back at their tag page for oral histories. And some that stood out were an oral history of the SNL sketch David S. Pumpkins, starring Tom Hanks. An oral history of the Eyes Wide Shut orgy scene. An oral history of the time that Bob Costas had pink eye at the Sochi Olympics.
I've forgotten some of these.
And so these are, extremely, as I say, sliced extremely thinly. But oral history in the book format can be pretty. There's a pretty robust bibliography. Talk to me a little bit about your thoughts on oral histories, great ones that you can remember reading, and what you think makes them great.
Well, it's funny, not everyone is a fan of the form. I mean, George Plimpton, who we can talk about him because he's a big player in this, his book that he did with Gene Stein about Edie Sedgwick. It was called Edie, American Girl, which came out in 1982. It was the modern re-entry of the oral history into the American consciousness. It became a bestseller. It was a big deal. Edie Sedgwick was this from this old Boston family, and she fell into Warhol's downtown scene. So it was a great combination of sort of aristocratic glamour and this little girl. I want to say little girl lost, because she was kind of lost, but she was a complicated character. The old school aristocratic sense and the Warhol sense really made a great blend, and people really gravitated towards that book. But of course, to talk about Plimpton, I mean, he sort of gets credit for helping the interview become a literary form in a way, because at the Paris Review, which of course he founded in the 1950s or co-founded with others, they really have the best interviews, at least of writers, that we have in this country, in English at any rate. And so he sort of pioneered that form in a way. And he went on to do another one, at least one more that I'm aware of, about Truman Capote that he did in 1997. So Plimpton was a key figure here. He said that one of the pleasures of the form is that the reader, rather than the editor, is the jury. And other people fought back at that idea. Elizabeth Hardwick, the great critic, said that she thought they had too many drive-by shootings in them. And she said, you are not ultimately what other people say about you. And she thought that too much loose talk made them a disreputable form. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I can see her point a little bit. But of course, interviews, Gilbert, of course, we know go way back. I mean, but in more recent times, someone that I really loved to read when I was younger, before Edie, was Studs Terkel, who did books like Hard Times about the Great Depression and about working life in America, and The Good War about World War II. And his form was different. He would take one person. He would interview you, the watermelon seller, and take your talk and make a whole essay out of it, just using your words. And they're great books. He was very good at it. But after Plimpton, the gates opened, I mean, some of the famous ones, Live from New York, Tom Shales' history, Oral History of Saturday Night Live, Voices from Chernobyl, Svetlana Alexievich's book about Chernobyl was quite good. Please Kill Me, An Oral History of Punk by Legs McNeil. I loved one called Meet Me in the Bathroom by Lizzie Goodman, which was a oral history of sort of the New York music scene around the year 2000. The Strokes, the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, if I have that right, Ryan Adams, other people. It's just great. Hilarious lines. I just love to read it. Do you have favorites?
I do. So you're right. Studs Terkel, of course, the grandfather of the modern oral history, who won a Pulitzer for The Good War, which was his book about World War II. I've never read Please Kill Me by Legs McNeil, which is the uncensored oral history of punk. But when I worked at Time Magazine, I got a nasty letter from Legs McNeil. I will tell you about it off mic. Meet Me in the Bathroom, as you point out. That was my time. I got to New York back from college in the mid-2000s, and I was on the Lower East Side, and I was seeing all of these bands. And so a book like that, which I read years ago, was sort of a nostalgia rush for me. It's funny that you bring up Tom Shales, who just died this year. He died, I think, a couple of weeks ago. He was a longtime TV critic at the Washington Post. He wrote that very famous oral history of Saturday Night Live, but he and his co-writer, James Andrew Miller, not only did the SNL one, but they did a very famous one about ESPN called Those Guys Have All the Fun, which I think is pretty popular. One that I remember from years ago, it's funny that you bring up George Plimpton, because there was an oral history about George Plimpton that Graydon Carter reviewed for the New York Times many years ago.
I know Slate did one. Was that the one you're talking? Was there a book?
It's a full book.
Oh, my God.
It's a full book reviewed by Graydon Carter, and this is the name. The name is George Being George, and the subtitle is the following. George Plimpton's life, as told, admired, deplored, and envied by 200 friends, relatives, lovers, acquaintances, rivals, and a few unappreciative observers. It was a very, very non-internet-y headline right there. It's not something that you would search for. But I haven't read this book in years. I probably read it 15 years ago, but I remember sort of falling in love with the world of George Plimpton and the Paris Review as a result of this great oral history. So you have all these categories. You have music oral histories, literary oral histories. I love the movie oral history. There was one that came out last year called Hollywood and Oral History, which is very interesting and went into the archives of maybe the Academy Museum or something and took quotes from completely different eras sometimes and smashed them up against each other into this massive attempt at trying to come up with a sort of a new version of classic Hollywood history. We have a couple people here at the Times who have written great ones. My former Vulture colleague Kyle Buchanan wrote an oral history about the movie Mad Max Fury Road, which is pretty wild. I don't know if you are a fan of that movie or have watched it.
Love the movie. I've
times,
not read the book.
Like I have.
Yeah.
Jonathan Abrams, who used to be a sports writer here, has written an oral history about The Wire, an oral history about the rise of hip-hop. And the thing, as you alluded to before, that I love most about oral histories, I just rattled off a bunch, is, I don't know if you put it this way, is the drive-by. Is the thing where someone just has a stray, that person was a real piece of crap, like comment that's thrown in there. It's sort of my favorite thing in an oral history is when someone has a long sort of diatribe and then you'll have the one or two line retort from someone who says, Yeah, that's not how it happened.
There's a great moment in this book where I believe it's Susan Brown Miller goes after James Wolcott, of course, the great critic. We all know who Susan Brown Miller is, a great feminist writer. And she makes some crack about Wolcott writing some letter she didn't like. And she says to the interviewer, he's going to lie about it and say he didn't do it. And then she prints the letter. There it is. She just catches him right in the... And I'm a big fan of... Actually, here's a true story. I remember being at college and finding James Wolcott's writing in the Village Voice. And I went to myself, holy cow, this is amazing criticism. I still think Wolcott is probably the best living cultural critic writ large alive. And I went and I found out that he used to work at The Voice. So I went to the microfilm room and Xeroxed out all of his... He wrote TV criticism as well as movie criticism for The Voice. And I still have these printouts 40 years later. Again and again in this book, people call him probably the greatest writer The Voice has produced, or at least the greatest critic. I'm not sure they would say writer, but greatest critic to come out of it. Anyway, I'm just a huge fan, and that was a funny moment in the book.
That is an amazing thing to say about a place that had just, Murderer's Row is the cliche of cliches, but the number of critics that either passed through or worked there for a while is pretty overwhelming. You had Grail Marcus, Lester Bangs worked there for a time, Stephen Holden, Janet Maslin, the great Jonas Mekas, Andrew Saris, who's the film critic who introduced the auteur theory to American audiences, Greg Tate, who's the Titanic music critic, Nelson George, Stanley Crouch. There's just so many critics came through this place. And it was, for someone like me, who was a young person growing up in the Bronx and wanted to learn about culture, it was a one-stop shop every week for trying to figure out how to think about movies and how to think about books and how to think about music. Every year when the Paz and Jop poll came out, which is an inversion of jazz and pop, they would poll critics every year and really come up with their own annual canon, essentially, for the year's best album.
And the Paz and Jop polls, they read like oral histories, only because each writer would just have these little sort of 3-line things. It wasn't like this boring thing where you all go and write your essay about the year. No, it said, send like 3 lines about things that are on your mind or that bugged you this year. And so this quick hits about things in the Paz and Jop poll, which made it really readable. To go back to James Wolcott, I think that I would revise. I might say, even though, forgive me, James, I'm a big fan of your work, I would say that he was the critic's critic. If you read him closely, you really... I'm not sure he has the impact, the cultural import, perhaps, of some of the critics you named. But as a critic's critic, sentence by sentence, he was sort of, people say, maybe the great one, and I would subscribe to that. But The Voice just covered things that other people... I remember, if I can talk about this anecdote, Guy Trebay now is a writer for The Times. He writes about style and culture and fashion, and he's a very good writer. But he was a big writer at The Voice. And it was a big deal, this book points out, when Trebay went to The Times, sort of, selling out, going to work at The Times. So Trebay would cover New York in this crazy way. I remember him in one piece, it sort of blew my mind when I was back in Vermont, where he discovered this society, supposedly, for men who were, let's just say, well-endowed. And he went to this meeting and wrote this piece about this meeting of sort of guys who were proud of their things. And there was Trebay doing a whole big cover story on it. The art was hilarious, whatever it was. And you would never find that in the New York Times.
I think you're right. You normally wouldn't find that on a New York Times podcast, but here we are. I'd love to talk briefly, if you have any thoughts, speaking of another writer, about Robert Christgau. Do you have any thoughts on him?
Well, the quote-unquote dean of rock criticism was there at the beginning, wrote a lot of almost the very first important rock criticism. He was the second Village Voice music editor after someone whose name is escaping me now. It was Richard Goldstein, I believe it is. I think that's right. But one of the reasons that in this book, one of the fun things about this book, if you care at all about editing and writing, is that he was a revered editor in addition to a music critic. As a music critic, one of the great things he did as a sort of mock, it wasn't cool to put letter grades on reviews and at all. But he sort of did the inverse thing. He decided to use them because they were so uncool. So he would give these pages each week or once a month where he would give letter grades to a bunch of different records. And he was the master of the short form put down. I remember in his review of an early Prince record, he wrote something like, Mick Jagger should fold up his penis and go home. Like that was the only line, or something like that.
Very famous one.
That was the kind of thing he would just put. And he didn't really, just these short hits that were hilarious. And anyway, he also is revered in this book for his editing skills. I guess he was a very tough editor, and people hated him until they realized that he was right and he made their pieces better. And it's sort of it dawns on a lot of writers in this book what a great editor he was. And he's still a writer. It's funny, a lot of these voice people now, you can find them on Substack. Something in me wants to go grab them all and make a senior citizen version of The Voice by lashing them all together and putting them somewhere, because Christgau has a Substack. I believe Nelson George has a Substack. Laurie Stone has a Substack. Those are just the first 3 I can think of. And a lot of these writers are still out there. And America needs to do better by its older writers, I think. I'm going on a tangent here, but one of my favorite magazines is a magazine in England called The Oldie, and it's just a version of a magazine written by people over 60, and it's hilarious and it's funny, literate people. And I feel like a lot of our older writers have sort of put out to pasture in a way. Christgau and Laurie Stone and Nelson George on their Substacks are doing great work. I don't know who reads it. I do. It's good.
So a couple things. One, that was Robert Christgau's review of Prince's Dirty Mind.
Okay.
Great album. Number two, we're talking a lot about critics, and several years ago, our podcast brothers over at Popcast did a whole episode on the Village Voices, John Caramonica's pop music podcast. He had Nelson George on. He had John Perellis on. I think he had Christgau on. So if any of this sounds interesting to you listeners, you should go check out that episode as well. One thing I wanted to come back to in terms of why places like The Voice don't exist anymore, the internet has allowed a million lights to shine, and you have all these Substacks, and you have so much more writing by so many more people than you really ever had access to before. But The Voice and many of its alt-weekly sort of brothers and sisters have gone away, and they've gone away because of the internet. They've gone away because all of the money that they used to make from advertising and the classifieds and the apartment listings and to be very honest, the sex ads in the back of the Village Voice, all that stuff has gone away. And once you took that away, there really was no way to make this sort of economically viable in the way that it was for many decades.
Yeah, it was brutal. Tricia Romano gives three reasons, really. I mean, the big one is, like you said, the internet in general, and Craigslist in particular, by taking away the classifieds, really helped sink The Voice. Also, she cites the gentrification of downtown. I mean, downtown used to be was scrubby, when The Voice was in its heyday. And now there are luxury apartments, and artists can't afford to live in the Village anymore. They're not there anymore. I mean, and C was the kind of issues that The Voice embraced, the cultural issues, the countercultural issues, the interest in gay rights and civil rights. They've been embraced by the culture writ large, or at least by most serious newspapers. And so the subject matter has been absorbed and taken away as well for the most part.
Do you find that the types of writing that you used to be able to find in The Voice you've just been able to find elsewhere? Or does it feel like something has actually been lost?
I feel like something's been lost. It wasn't just the single writing. It was just the whole gestalt of the thing. You would pick it up and it was so prickly. The whole thing just felt like this production that someone had really thought through, from the great cartoon to the great photograph to the crazy hard news in the front to the different voices in back. It all came together into a package. And there are still great writers out there, but it doesn't feel the same anymore. And I miss, too, that no one's really taken over, to my point of view. I mean, I'm a 59-year-old New Yorker who likes to go out a lot and do things and see a lot of culture. And I know you are, too. You've worked in culture for a long time. No one, to my mind, is duplicated the listings the Village Voice has in terms of my interest. There's no one-stop shopping to find the great listings at every club and every major theater. So just a great rundown of what one might be interested in doing. There are listings everywhere, but somehow no one gets them in one little place for me. And do you have a place you go for all that?
When the Village Voice started to fade, I still felt like I could rely on Time Out New York in a way, but even Time Out New York, the New York version of the London magazine, doesn't really exist in the way that it used to anymore. It was a magazine that was almost entirely listings, and it's also gone. I mean, the New York Times used to run listings every weekend in the Friday print culture section, and we don't do that anymore. So I think it's like much of culture, whether you're talking about how people are accessing TV or cinema or music, it's just become so atomized. And you used to have these clearinghouses for information, and everyone's sort of on their own. Everyone is left to their own devices. And I don't know where to go. But I know where people that care about books can go. They can go to the New York Times Book Review.
Good job, Gilbert.
Thank you.
And nice segue into the other podcast as well, because that was a good episode. I will say, we haven't talked about this at all, but the Village Voice had a really good book section. The VLS, run by a woman named M. Mark. One of those things that comes out in this book is what a breakthrough it was when the great rock critic and essayist Ellen Willis used her first name in The Voice, because at the time, a lot of the voice writers went by their first initials. M. Mark, I think her name was Marcia Mark. She didn't like the sound of her own name because it reminded her of the Brady Bunch. She went with M, more dignified, she thought. Cynthia Carr went by C. Carr. She's now a biographer. She wrote about art. Brilliant. And M. Mark, anyway, ran the VLS, the Voice Literary Supplement. And it had a really driving impact on a lot of the downtown writers at the time, a lot of gay writers, Gary, Indiana, and other people it sort of gave lifts to. And it was an important place. It was sort of short-lived, but for a while it went national. It was a national edition of the VLS. And I was really proud to write for it. I think the first great phone call of my life, I was in college. I had sent some clips to the Village Voice. An editor named Scott Malcolmson left a voicemail, my proto-voicemail, whatever we had of voicemail back in 1985.
Was that just an answering machine?
Probably.
No, your service? Did he call your service?
My service, of course.
Yeah.
But just like, I think he used the word bummer, man. It's like, hey, I remember his voice to this day. Like, I pick up my voice message, however I got it, and hey, Dwight, it's Scott Malcolmson for the Village Voice. And I think I like the way you used the word bummer in the third paragraph of that review. I think you might be able to write for us. Like, give me a call. And I remember just jumping up and down for about 7 hours. It was just like the greatest thing that ever happened to me because I revered the voice. And anyway, this was a great sort of nostalgia fest for me, even if the writers and critics there aren't that nostalgic.
I had a great time reading. I read 3/4 of The Freaks Came Out to Write. It's quite a big book. Dwight, you gave it a very positive review. I urge anyone who is interested in sort of latter 20th century New York history, interested in arts criticism, interested in journalism, interested in all the crazy things that were happening in New York in the 70s and 80s to pick up this book and to check it out. Dwight, as always, thank you for coming on.
That was really fun, Gilbert. Thank you.
That was my conversation with Times book critic Dwight Garner about Tricia Romano's The Freaks Came Out to Write. We talked about The Village Voice, we talked about alt weeklies, we talked about oral histories, we talked about living in New York. It's basically what I talk about on every episode here. I am Gilbert Cruz. This is the New York Times Book Review. Thank you for listening.